Daniel picked up the bread from the bread box, set it on his plate, then looked at me with that particular expression, patient, measured, the expression of a man preparing to explain something for someone's own good. "Mom, you know you shouldn't store bread in a wooden bread box, right? The humidity. Mold develops 3 times faster than in a paper bag." I looked at him. Then I stood up, walked out of the kitchen, came back 40 seconds later. I placed a sheet of paper next to his plate. Page 9, Journal of Food Science, 2022, highlighted in yellow. Wooden bread boxes with ventilation holes reduce humidity by 31% compared to sealed containers. Ours has 3 holes. Christina stared at the sheet, then at Daniel. Daniel read it, said nothing. "Mom, what is this?" "A source. You like sources. I'm learning." "Did you actually—" Page 9, 3rd paragraph. There's a footnote. I highlighted that too. "My name is Margaret Collins, 64 years old, 38 years a literature teacher. My son Daniel is 36, a data analyst, smart, caring, and 8 months ago he moved in with me, temporarily, and somewhere along the way decided his mother had finally reached the age where everything needed to be explained to her. The proper temperature for storing olive oil, the right way to brew tea, what I felt when I was cold, because the data said otherwise. Once he corrected my Dickens quote. Mine, Dickens, the one I had taught for 22 years. That's when I understood. The only way to fight a man who loves sources is to love them more. This is the story of how I got to the folder. Please like and subscribe. This helps the channel, and as it turns out, I know how to work with sources. Peter died 3 years ago in April, on a Tuesday, which felt wrong because Tuesdays were always ordinary days, grocery days, laundry days, days for paying bills and calling the dentist. He had a heart attack in the garden among his tomatoes, and our neighbor, Mrs. Patel, found him when she came to return a pot she'd borrowed in February. I don't know why I remember the pot. I remember everything about that day in pieces that don't quite fit together. After the funeral, people told me I was strong. I wasn't strong. I was just still moving. There's a difference, but it takes time to learn it. The house was ours for 41 years, a 3-bedroom on Elm Street with a front porch and a garden that got too much sun in summer and not enough in spring, which Peter spent the last decade trying to fix through a series of increasingly elaborate shade structures that never quite worked. I kept them, all of them, even the one that leaned. Daniel called every Sunday. Sometimes he came by on Saturday for coffee, and we'd sit on the porch and talk about whatever, books, politics, his work, the neighbors, a recipe I'd tried that week. He was a good son. I want to be clear about that. He was a genuinely good son who came by on Saturdays and called on Sundays and remembered my birthday without a reminder. In 36 years, he had never once been malicious toward me. That is important to understand before I tell you what happened. Because what happened had nothing to do with malice. The renovation was supposed to take 3 months. Their apartment downtown, a modern 2-bedroom that Christina had decorated in a style she called Nordic minimalism, and I privately called a hospital with plants, needed new plumbing throughout, which turned into new floors, which turned into new walls, which turned into a conversation at my kitchen table where Daniel said, "Mom, would it be okay if we stayed here for a bit, just until things settle?" I said, of course. I meant it. I had 3 bedrooms and was using one for sleeping and one for books, and the thought of the house being a little less quiet was not unpleasant. That was 8 months ago. The first 2 weeks were genuinely lovely. Christina made dinner on Wednesdays. She was a better cook than she appeared, which is something I would never tell her because she already knew it. Daniel fixed the gutter that had been loose since September. We watched a documentary about Ottoman architecture on a Friday night and argued pleasantly about whether the Blue Mosque was more beautiful inside or outside. I said inside. Daniel said outside. Christina said the question was structurally flawed. We laughed. I should have paid more attention to that last part. The first correction came on a Thursday, over breakfast, 11 days in. I was telling Daniel about an article I'd read about vitamin D deficiency. There had been a study, something about bone density, and he nodded and then said gently, reaching for his coffee, "Actually, the latest research suggests that the link between vitamin D supplementation and bone density outcomes is more complicated than earlier studies indicated. There was a meta-analysis, I heard about it on a podcast, that basically shows the benefits are overstated for women who are already getting baseline sun exposure." I looked at him. He looked back at me with the expression of someone who has just been very helpful. "Thanks, Daniel," I said. I remember thinking, he was always like this. Even as a boy, he brought home printouts from encyclopedias to prove things. When he was 9, he arrived at Sunday dinner with 3 pages of documentation about the extinction of dinosaurs. He wanted everyone to know he had checked. It had been then rather sweet. I thought about that, and then I took my vitamin D that afternoon. Not because I believed he was wrong, and not because I believed he was right, but because I was suddenly very aware that I wanted to be able to say I was already taking it. I noted this thought in my mind as something worth examining later. I did not examine it. Not yet. The phone conversation happened on a Monday morning. I was in the living room reading. I had gotten back to Trollope, whom I'd been meaning to reread for years. And Daniel and Christina were at the kitchen table with a laptop open between them, speaking in the low, focused tones of people making practical decisions. I was not trying to eavesdrop. I simply read Trollope in a house where other people lived, which is not the same thing. "This one looks good," Christina said. "Big buttons, loudspeaker, emergency call button." "Yeah," Daniel said. "The interface is simple. She won't get confused. And the case comes in orange, so she won't lose it." I turned a page. "I read The Guardian in the original, Daniel," I said without looking up. "I don't need an emergency call button." A pause. "Mom, we just want you to be safe." I turned another page. "Very sweet," I said. And it was sweet. That was the worst part. It was genuinely, entirely, completely sweet. He was not being condescending in the way that condescending people are condescending, with awareness and intent. He was being condescending in the way that very caring, very organized people sometimes are, with love and a spreadsheet and no idea whatsoever. I sat with Trollope and thought, they are discussing the purchase of my future phone. I am 1 meter away. They did not ask. I filed this thought alongside the vitamin D and kept reading. Inside, a small part of me said something brief and impolite that I will not repeat here, because this is a family story, and also because I was a literature teacher for 38 years and I have a reputation to maintain. The armchair had been in the corner of the living room since 1991. It was Peter's originally, one of those wide, low chairs upholstered in a dark green fabric that had long since worn soft at the arms and sunken perfectly in the seat. Peter used to fall asleep in it on Sunday afternoons with a book open on his chest. After he died, I moved it to my side of the room, and it became mine, and I read in it every evening and had read perhaps 200 books in it in the 3 years since, and it had a specific, irreplaceable quality that I can only describe as the feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be. I came home from my Tuesday walk. I walked every Tuesday, 3 kilometers. I had done this for 11 years, and the chair was on the front porch. In its place in the living room corner, a cat scratching post, tall, beige, wrapped in sisal rope. Christina's cat, an expressionless gray creature named Figaro, was sitting beside it with the air of something that has won. Daniel came in from the kitchen. "Oh, we moved the chair," he said. "It was disrupting the flow of the space. Christina found a really good ergonomic one online. Great lumbar support. It's being delivered Thursday." I looked at the scratching post. Did the cat prefer my armchair to his scratching post? Or did the scratching post prefer the location of my armchair? "Mom, I'm trying to understand the hierarchy." "It's just a chair." "Yes, my chair, in my corner, in my house." I brought the armchair back inside that evening, put it in the bedroom, sat in it for an hour with Trollope. Peter would have found this funny. He would have said, "Margaret, darling, I believe you've just lost a territorial dispute with a cat and won it back on a technicality." He would have been right, and he would have been laughing. I missed him with the specific, quiet ache that doesn't announce itself, but sits in the room with you like a third person. I noted the armchair in my mind alongside the telephone and the vitamin D. 3 things now. Ellen and Dorothy came for dinner on a Thursday. Ellen had taught history at the same school for 29 years. We'd shared a prep room for most of them. And Dorothy had been my department chair until she retired 6 years ago and wrote a small, excellent book about Victorian women's education that got reviewed in the Times Literary Supplement and sold, as she put it, enough copies to justify the existence of the index. They were my oldest friends. They had known me longer than Daniel had been alive. Christina answered the door. This was, I recognized, not a transgression. She lived here. She was closer to the door. But the way she gestured them in had something proprietary in it, a small hostess authority that registered in the air. At the table, she introduced me. "This is Daniel's mom," she said, "Margaret. She's very homey, very quiet, doesn't get out much." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Ellen looked at me. Her expression said, "Shall I handle this, or will you?" I smiled. 40 years of teaching, I said. 2 books on pedagogical methodology. 3 international conferences. But yes, very quiet. Christina laughed as if I had made a self-deprecating joke. I had not made a self-deprecating joke. Dorothy, who had survived 30 years of faculty politics and could read a room like a map, moved the conversation on with a graceful question about the renovation, and we got through the appetizers without incident. Then, over the main course, I mentioned Dickens. I was telling a story, an anecdote about a student years ago who had argued passionately in an essay that Pip from Great Expectations was, at his core, a social climber who deserved his disappointments. I had disagreed with the reading, but given the essay an A for the argument. I quoted the line I had used in my comments, the one about the difference between ambition and aspiration. It was from the novel. I had read it aloud to students perhaps 100 times. Daniel looked up from his plate. "Mom, I think that line actually goes a little differently. Let me check." He took out his phone. Ellen put down her fork. I watched him scroll. I watched him find it. I watched him read it with the mild satisfaction of someone locating a correct answer. "Yeah, see," he said, turning the screen toward me. "It's ambition may be, not ambition is." I looked at the screen, then at my son. "Daniel," I said, "I taught Dickens for 22 years. "Right, but I taught this specific novel for 22 years. I know, but here at Ellen, I said, do you happen to remember which of us taught the Victorian literature unit? You did, for 22 years. Thank you. Daniel looked at his phone, then at Ellen, then at me. I was just making sure, he said. Of course, I said. I looked at Ellen. Her face was doing something careful and controlled. Later, in the kitchen while we washed up, she leaned close and said, Margaret, what the hell? I know. He fact-checked Dickens. You. Dickens. Are you going to do something about this? I'm thinking. She looked at me for a moment. Let me know if you need a witness, she said. The weeks that followed had a certain rhythm to them, and I found that rhythm, once I started paying attention to it, genuinely impressive in its consistency. Week 3, olive oil. The temperature of the kitchen near the stove degraded extra virgin olive oil faster than storage away from heat sources. He had read this somewhere. He explained it to me while I was cooking, standing at my elbow, patient and informative. I listened. Then I said, Has it been going off, do you think? In the 30 years I've stored it there? Slowly degrading, yes. Interesting. I've been standing near the stove for 30 years as well. I suppose I'm also slowly degrading. Mom, that's different. The oil hasn't complained, I said, but then neither have I, until now. He blinked, not understanding, I think, that he had just been told something. He had heard words, but not the sentence. I went back to cooking. In my notebook, I had started a notebook by then, just for myself, a small blue one from the stationery drawer. I wrote, olive oil, 3 words. Then, 30 years, 2 more. Week 4, tea. The water, apparently, should not be fully boiled for green tea. It should be heated to 80 degrees and no more, or the polyphenols degrade. I had been making green tea for approximately 40 years. I had made it, based on conservative estimates, somewhere in the vicinity of 8,000 times. And how has it tasted? Well, not as good as it could. I've enjoyed it, I said, very much, for 40 years. But objectively, taste is subjective, Daniel. The chemistry isn't. Are you telling me that my tea, which I have enjoyed for 40 years, is objectively wrong? A pause. I'm just saying there's a better way. I wrote tea, then 40 years, then, in smaller writing, 8,000 cups, approximately. Week 5 brought something I had not expected, and which I filed in a different part of my mind than the others. I had a routine appointment with my doctor, Dr. Osei, who had been my physician for 14 years and whom I liked very much. Daniel offered to drive me. I said it wasn't necessary. He said he'd like to come. I said, all right. In the examination room, Dr. Osei asked the standard questions. How was I sleeping? How was my energy? Any new symptoms? I answered. Then Daniel said, she's had some changes recently, some memory things. And I've noticed she gets tired in the afternoons, and sometimes she seems a bit... Dr. Osei looked at me. I looked at the wall, then at my son, then at the ceiling, then back at Dr. Osei. Dr. Osei, I can tell you the names of every student I taught in my first 10 years. That's approximately 240 people. Would that be helpful? Dr. Osei had the grace to look slightly amused. I don't think that's necessary, she said. Memory things, I said to Daniel in the car afterward. Mom, You told my doctor I have memory problems. I didn't say problems. I said things. In a doctor's office, things means problems. A silence. I'm just worried, he said. I know, I said. I looked out the window. I thought, there is a specific kind of helplessness that comes from being argued against on behalf of yourself. It is not rage. It is something quieter and more persistent. It is the feeling of standing in a room where people are discussing the furniture and you are the furniture. In my notebook, I wrote, Doctor. Then, after a moment, I underlined it. Week 6, red wine. He had read, he said, several recent studies suggesting that the benefits of moderate red wine consumption had been significantly overstated in earlier research, and that the antioxidant narrative was largely based on industry-funded studies from the 90s. He said this while I was pouring my first glass of a Côte de Rhône that I had been looking forward to since Tuesday. I set the bottle down, looked at the glass, then poured a second glass, preemptively. I know, I read about it too. And you're still? I survived 1987, 3 impossible principles, and a pandemic, Daniel. A glass of wine is not going to be what gets me. That's not really Besides, the polyphenol studies are genuinely mixed. If you want sources, I can find you sources. He stopped, looked at me. What? Nothing, I said. I'm just saying I can find sources too, if it would help. A small silence. Something passed across his face. Not quite doubt, not quite recognition. Something in between. He heard what I said and did not quite know what to do with it. He said nothing further about the wine. Later, after he and Christina had gone upstairs, I sat with the last half glass and thought about that expression, about the moment it had appeared. In the notebook, red wine. Then, in different ink, later that evening, I think I have an idea. The wine was excellent, incidentally, the studies notwithstanding. Week 7, the dinner with Robert. Robert was Daniel's younger brother, 41, an architect, less intense than Daniel, with a better sense of humor and a corresponding habit of diffusing tension by pretending not to notice it. He came with his wife, Suzanne, who was warm and direct and brought a very good bottle of Burgundy, which I accepted with specific pleasure. We sat down to dinner. Within 20 minutes, Daniel had corrected me 3 times. The year of our trip to Portugal. I said 1998. He said we hadn't been. He'd checked. We went in 2001. I had photographs from 1998, but I let it go. The flour ratio in the pie crust. I had made this pie crust for 30 years. He had recently discovered the importance of precise ratios. The correct pronunciation of a street name in Lisbon. I had walked that street. Robert had stopped eating by the 3rd one. He was looking at his plate with an expression I recognized from 38 years of teaching. The expression of a student who has noticed something that cannot be unnoticed and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. He always like this? Not always. More on weekends recently. That was a joke? Mostly, I said. Robert looked up at me. For a moment, we looked at each other across the table. He had his father's eyes, the same slight downward angle at the corners, what Peter always called his sympathetic expression. He looked in that moment genuinely sympathetic. He said nothing, but he looked. Week 8 was a Monday evening. Dinner was finished. I was washing up at the sink, the radio on low. There was a program I liked, a literature discussion, 2 professors talking about George Eliot, and Daniel and Christina were in the living room. I could hear them in the intermissions between sentences. Do you ever feel like she has trouble following longer conversations? Like tonight at dinner? A pause. She just gets tired, Daniel said. She's getting older. Right, but sometimes she seems like she's not quite... She's fine, Christina. I'm just saying maybe we should... I turned off the tap. I stood there, water on my hands. The radio professor was saying something about Middlemarch, about how Eliot understood that the most profound transformations happen in the quietest moments, in the privacy of a changed mind. I thought, I have spent 38 years teaching people to think, to question, to verify, to not accept authority simply because it speaks with confidence. I stood in classrooms and I asked children, and they became adults in those classrooms. I watched it happen. I asked them to slow down, to look again, to check the source, to ask who is speaking and why, to understand that certainty is not the same as truth. I did all of this for 38 years, for 900 children. And then I came home, and I said, "Yes, Daniel. Thanks, Daniel. You're probably right, Daniel. I'll look into that, Daniel." I dried my hands. I walked to the study, sat down at the desk, opened the laptop. Then I opened the notebook, turned to the list, read it through from the beginning. Vitamin D, olive oil, tea, Dickens. This I underlined twice. The telephone, the armchair, the doctor, red wine, Portugal, pie crust, Lisbon. 11 items, 11 entries, each one small, each one offered with love, each one landing like a hand placed firmly on my shoulder to guide me in a direction I had not asked to go. I looked at the list for a long time. Then I typed into the search bar, Journal of Food Science, wooden bread box, humidity study. The printer was in the corner. I turned it on. I want to be precise about what I was not doing. I was not angry. Anger is hot and specific and wants a response immediately, wants to raise its voice, wants to be heard in the moment. What I had was something cooler and more methodical. What I had was 38 years of knowing that the best way to teach someone to examine their assumptions is not to argue with them. Argument produces defensiveness. What produces learning, real learning, the kind that stays, is evidence. Irrefutable, documented, properly cited evidence placed calmly in front of a person, and then silence, and then the moment when they read it. I had given that moment to hundreds of students. I knew exactly what it looked like. I was a literature teacher, but I had spent 3 decades teaching teenagers how to write research papers, how to find a primary source, how to distinguish a study from an anecdote, a meta-analysis from a podcast episode, a finding from a conclusion. I knew exactly what a proper source looked like. I knew the specific, irreversible feeling of having your argument returned to you with the relevant section highlighted in yellow. I opened the laptop. I typed, Journal of Food Science, wooden bread box, humidity study. The printer warmed up with its clicking sounds, which had always reminded me of a teacher clearing their throat before beginning a lesson. I printed the breadbox study, read it carefully, all of it, not just the abstract. Found the passage Daniel had cited from his podcast. It was there, in an older section of the literature review, a study from 2014. Then I found the more recent research, the ventilation findings, the humidity differential data, the comparison between sealed containers and ventilated wooden containers of various constructions. I highlighted the relevant paragraph in yellow, page 9, third paragraph. Our bread box had 3 holes in the lid. I noted this in pencil in the margin, along with the date. Everything he had said was correct in the general direction and wrong in the specific conclusion. This was, in my experience, the most common kind of wrong. It felt like right. It arrived with the confidence of right. It was, under examination, not right. I put the sheet in a folder, Then I went back to the search bar. Olive oil storage near heat sources. Tea brewing temperatures. The Dickens passage. I found the original, the complete passage from the first edition, not just the line, and printed the relevant page from the Project Gutenberg edition with the passage highlighted and a note in the margin in my handwriting. Page 203, Chapter 32, First edition, 1861. Not a photocopy, a proper citation, the kind I would have required from a student. I worked until past midnight. The house was quiet. The kitchen light was on. I had moved to the kitchen table, where there was more room, and the printer ran intermittently while outside the garden was dark and still, and Peter's shade structure leaned very slightly in the corner where it had always leaned. When I went to bed, the folder had 7 sheets. Each one was neat. Each had the relevant section highlighted in yellow. Each had a note at the top in my handwriting, the date, the claim Daniel had made, the source. I put the folder on the nightstand. I thought, I am 64 years old. I have read approximately 4,000 books. I have corrected approximately 60,000 essays. I stood in classrooms and asked children, who became adults in those classrooms. I watched it happen. I asked them to bring me evidence, always evidence, not feeling and not authority and not certainty, but evidence, for 38 years. I am also, it turns out, a woman who has been told her bread box is a health hazard while sitting 18 inches away and said, "Thanks, Daniel, not anymore." I turned out the light, not angry, ready. The folder made its first appearance on a Wednesday. It was not planned as a performance. I want to be honest about this. It was not a scheme with a predetermined dramatic arc. I simply had the folder, and at dinner, Daniel mentioned that coffee after 3 in the afternoon disrupted circadian rhythms in adults over 55. And the research was very clear on this, and perhaps I should think about cutting back. I had 2 cups that day, the second one at 2:45, which was admittedly close to the boundary. I excused myself, went to the study, came back with 1 sheet of paper. Meta-analysis of 21 studies. The conclusion is on page 3. I've marked it. Moderate coffee consumption shows no significant correlation with sleep quality deterioration in physically active older women. Moderate is defined as up to 4 cups per day. He picked up the sheet. Where did? Journal of Sleep Research, 2021. There's a footnote about the distinction between acute sensitivity and chronic patterns. That's the highlighted section on page 4. He read it. He was quiet. Christina looked from the paper to me. Did you print this for this conversation? I've been doing a bit of reading, I said. Ellen came for lunch on Saturday. I showed her the folder. It had grown to 11 sheets by then, a sheet for each item in the notebook. She looked through it, slowly, methodically, in the way she read exam papers, not skimming, actually reading. She turned a page, then another, read the footnote I had added to the vitamin D sheet, examined the highlighted section on the olive oil study, paused at the Dickens bibliography. I had listed 7 scholarly editions, cross-referenced. She was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret," she said. "What?" "You've indexed it." "By date and topic," I said. "It seemed more professional." "You have a citation format." "Author date, it's the simplest." "You have a footnote on the vitamin D sheet." The original study had a methodological limitation I felt was worth noting. She put the folder down. Then she started to laugh. Properly, the full laugh, the one that happened when something genuinely surprised her. She had a very good laugh, Ellen, the kind that didn't apologize for itself. "This is the most you thing I have ever seen in my life. I'm a teacher. We cite." When is the next family dinner? 3 weeks. Robert's coming with Suzanne. I want to be there. Ellen, Margaret, I want to be there. I have been watching you teach for 29 years, and I want to be there when you teach this particular lesson. I looked at her. It would be strange to invite you specifically for this. Call it a general social occasion. Dorothy as well? Absolutely Dorothy as well. I thought about it for a moment, looked at the folder. It is not a performance, I said. It's a reference system. Of course it is, Ellen said. She refilled her own tea and looked entirely unconvinced. The folder grew. In the 3 weeks between that Saturday with Ellen and the Sunday dinner, I added 9 more sheets. The vitamin D sheet I had done first. I went back to it, found a more comprehensive study, reprinted with better highlighting. The Dickens passage I supplemented with a full bibliography of scholarly editions, annotated. The olive oil sheet became 2 sheets, one for the general study, one specifically about ventilation and humidity in wooden kitchen storage containers. I also added new ones. Daniel had mentioned that the correct position for reading, I had been sitting in the recovered armchair with a book angled toward the window, put strain on the neck and would lead to problems. I printed 3 pages from an ergonomics study. Our armchair, it turned out, was within the acceptable range of reading positions for adults with good spinal history. I had good spinal history. I noted this on the sheet. He had mentioned that walking on pavement rather than soft surfaces increased joint impact, and I should consider different routes for my Tuesday walks. I found the relevant literature on paved versus unpaved surface impact, highlighted the section about individual variation, and added a note. 11 years, no joint complaints, see GP records. The folder was 2 centimeters thick. I sat at the kitchen table the Friday evening before the Sunday dinner and went through each sheet one more time, reorganized them by topic, confirmed the highlights were clear, added a label to the front, Sources, Sunday dinner. Then I sat there for a while with my tea. I thought about Peter. He had been, in his quiet way, a stubborn man. Not loudly stubborn. He didn't argue. He simply continued. If he had decided something was right, he would do it, calmly, until the evidence either confirmed him or changed his mind, and either way he remained unruffled. He used to say that the point of being sure about something was that you didn't need anyone else to be sure for you. I thought, yes, that's exactly it. I closed the folder, went to bed. Saturday passed. I weeded the garden, which still had Peter's shade structure leaning in the corner. I made soup. I called Dorothy to confirm the time. Sunday morning. I made coffee, 2 cups, both before noon, and set the table. The folder sat on the kitchen counter. At 3 in the afternoon, when Daniel was helping lay out the food and Christina was arranging something on the kitchen counter, with the focused attention she gave to surfaces, I put the folder at my place at the table. Daniel glanced at it. "What's that?" "Just some papers," I said. He looked at it for a moment, then went back to the food. At 4 o'clock, Ellen arrived with a bottle of Chablis. She kissed me on the cheek and said, very quietly, "Is that it?" On the table. "Oh, brilliant, Ellen. What a lovely house," she said at normal volume to the room. Dorothy arrived 5 minutes later. Robert and Suzanne shortly after. 7 people at the table, which was the right number for the room, full but not crowded, with enough conversation to make the silences comfortable. We started with soup. The conversation went where it naturally went. Robert's current project, which involved a community center in a city I hadn't visited, Suzanne's sister, who had just moved to Edinburgh, a film Ellen had seen that she recommended with the specific qualifier that it was magnificent and deeply unpleasant, which is the combination I respect most. Dorothy had opinions about the Edinburgh decision. Robert had opinions about the film. It was the kind of dinner conversation I had always liked. Several threads at once, nobody managing it, everyone following their genuine interest. Christina was quiet but present. She had brought dessert, the almond cake, and she placed it on the sideboard with the careful attention she gave to objects and surfaces. And I thought, not for the first time, that she was a more private person than she appeared, and that her particular way of moving through spaces said something about her that I hadn't fully read yet. Dinner arrived. Daniel served, which he always did at group dinners, efficiently and without fuss. We settled. The wine was opened. Conversation resumed. Approximately 10 minutes in, Daniel set down his fork with the particular deliberateness that I had come to recognize as the preamble to information sharing, and said, "Actually, there's been some interesting research recently about red wine and oxidative stress. Apparently, the polyphenol connection is much weaker than the earlier studies suggested, and the antioxidant narrative is—" I opened the folder. The table went quiet. Not immediately. It was a gradual quiet, the quiet of people noticing something out of the corner of their eye and adjusting their attention. Daniel was still talking. I was leafing through pages with the measured pace of someone who knows exactly where something is and is confirming its location. I found the sheet, placed it beside his plate. 2023, Nutrition Reviews. The antioxidant narrative summary is on page 11. I've marked it. There are two competing frameworks. The conclusion is that the evidence is genuinely mixed, not that the benefits are overstated. Mixed means we don't know, which is different from wrong. Daniel looked at the sheet, then at me, then at the folder, which was still open. "Mom, is that—" "I've been doing some reading." Robert looked at the folder, then at Daniel, then back at the folder. His face was doing something careful. The dinner continued. It was a good dinner. Suzanne had brought a wonderful dessert, an almond cake with something in it that I couldn't identify and didn't ask about because some pleasures are better unanalyzed. And the conversation was warm and comfortable in the way that good family dinners are when nobody is performing and everyone is actually present. And then Daniel said, toward the end of the main course, that it was getting cold. Probably 8 or 9 degrees out, maybe colder with the wind. I opened the last section of the folder. Dorothy made a small noise. I placed the final sheet on the table. 11 degrees, National Weather Service, 7:45 this morning. Wind 3 kilometers per hour from the northwest, negligible factor for felt temperature. Current conditions are cool, not cold, by standard meteorological classification. I set the sheet down, looked at my son. Carry on. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Robert started laughing. Not politely, not briefly, actually laughing. The kind that happens when something has been building and finally arrives. Suzanne put her hand over her mouth. Ellen looked at the ceiling with an expression of profound satisfaction. Dorothy reached over and patted my hand once, firmly, like a coach. Daniel was very red. "Mom," he said, "did you print the weather forecast?" "You like sources." National Weather Service, official. I even checked the timestamp." Page 1, I said. "There's only one page, but I've highlighted the relevant section." Robert could not stop laughing. He had his hand over his face. Suzanne was now also laughing. Ellen and Dorothy had the expressions of women watching something they have waited a very long time to see. Daniel looked at the sheet, at the folder, at me. "How many sheets are in there?" 23, I said, indexed by topic and date. Since when? Since you explained my bread box to me. A silence. I have a bread box sheet, I said. Page 9, Journal of Food Science, 2022. The ventilation holes reduce humidity by 31%. I should say, you were correct about the general principle. The data just didn't support your specific conclusion. Daniel sat back in his chair. He looked at me for a long moment. The color in his face had shifted from embarrassed to something more complicated, something that I recognized because I had seen it in students on the day they realized they had been arguing from the wrong premise. I was trying to help. I know, I said. You were always trying to help. I closed the folder. The thing is, Daniel, I'm 64, not 94. I read. I think. I am sometimes wrong, genuinely wrong. And when that happens, I want to know about it. But I want to know about it the way adults tell other adults. Once, clearly, with evidence, and then we move on. Not at every dinner, not in front of the doctor, and not with a certainty that doesn't quite hold up under 20 minutes of searching. The table was very quiet. Robert had stopped laughing. He was watching his brother with that same expression, sympathetic, careful. Daniel looked at the folder, then at his hands. The Dickens thing, he said. Yes? I looked it up on my phone. You did. In front of Ellen and Dorothy. You did. Another silence. I taught Dickens for 22 years, I said. I know. I know you know. I just wanted to say it one more time. And then, because I am a woman who spent 38 years knowing when a lesson had landed, I picked up my wine glass and took a sip and said, Now, Suzanne, what's in this cake? It's extraordinary. The conversation started again. The following week, Christina mentioned, in the tone of someone saying something they have prepared carefully, that the renovation was finished, that they were planning to move back the week after next, that it had been lovely being here and they were so grateful. I said, of course, end of the month works perfectly. She looked at me for a moment. Were we very... A little bit, yes. A pause. I didn't realize. I know, that's usually how it goes. We drank our tea. It was a perfectly acceptable conversation. Robert called that Tuesday. Margaret, that was one of the best things I've ever seen at a dinner table. I'm glad you enjoyed yourself, I said. Daniel called me the next day. Did he? He wanted to know if I thought he'd been, his word was condescending. What did you tell him? I said I thought he'd been acting out of love, and that acting out of love doesn't protect you from acting like an ass. That's a very good answer, Robert. I thought so. He also said he was going to call you. He did call, Sunday. How was it? I thought about the phone call, about Daniel's voice, careful and honest, asking if he had made me feel, and then stopping as if the sentence had become harder than he expected. About my answer, which was yes, sometimes, a bit. About the silence that followed, and then the conversation that grew out of it, slow and careful and better than the silence. Good, I said. It was good. 3 months after they moved out, the living room was entirely mine again. The armchair was back in the corner. I had never moved it from the bedroom, actually, but I moved it back the day after they left, and it sat exactly as it always had, with the slight lean it had developed in the 90s and the worn arm on the right side where both Peter and I had rested our elbows for decades. It was not ergonomically optimal. It was perfect. The cat-scratching post was gone. Figaro went with it. The kitchen had its olive oil back in the usual place, and if the polyphenols were degrading quietly, I had made my peace with that. The bread box sat on the counter with its 3 ventilation holes, doing exactly what the research said it would do. Daniel called on Sundays. The conversations were different, looser, more equal, the kind where both people asked questions instead of one person answering them. He told me about his work, a new project he was genuinely excited about, something involving traffic pattern analysis for a city planning initiative. He sounded the way he used to sound when he was younger and came home from school with something he'd learned that he actually wanted to share, not explain. I told him about the book I was reading, a novel by a writer he hadn't heard of, and he said he might try it, and I said I'd put my copy aside for him. Once, in November, he came for coffee, and we sat on the porch. It was too cold, really, but there was something we both wanted from the porch, the specific quality of sitting outside when the air is just sharp enough to make the conversation feel serious, and talked about Peter, about the shade structures, which had never worked and which I still hadn't taken down, about the tomatoes, which I had tried to grow again this year with moderate success, about how much and how differently we both missed him. Daniel had missed a father, and I had missed a person who was also a whole world. And those are different kinds of missing, though they sometimes sit at the same table. It was a very good conversation, one of the best we had had in years, possibly. On his way out, stopping at the door, he looked at the shelf in the hallway. The folder was there. I had put it there after the dinner, intending to recycle it, and then found I didn't quite want to. Is that? Yes. You kept it. I kept it. He looked at it for a moment. How many sheets? 23, indexed. A pause. Can I look at the Dickens one? I went to the shelf, opened the folder, found it. 3rd section under literature, 2 sheets, the passage and the full bibliography. Handed it to him. He read it. Took his time. You were right. I know. You were always going to be right about Dickens. Yes. I'm sorry about the doctor thing. I know. He left. I stood in the hall for a moment, folder in my hands. 23 sheets. Vitamin D and olive oil and tea and the weather and Dickens and the bread box and the wine and Portugal and the pie crust and Lisbon and the armchair in a way, though I hadn't made a sheet for the armchair because the armchair required no citation. It was mine, and that was its own kind of evidence. I put the folder back on the shelf. I thought, I don't know if I'll need it again. I think probably not. But the thing about knowing how to find sources is that you don't stop knowing. It stays in you. You carry it like a habit, like a reflex, like the ability to read a room, which I had spent 38 years developing and intended to keep. I went to the living room, sat in the armchair, picked up Trollope, turned to the page where I had left off. Outside, it was 11 degrees. I didn't need to check.